Dances with Robots, a conversation with Adeene Denton, originally recorded November 6th, 2024, on Riverside.
Good afternoon, Adeene. It's been a hot minute. Tell me, who are you and what do you do? And can you please describe yourself and your immediate surroundings?
Okay. Hi. Who am I? Many people are asking this question. I'm Adeene Denton. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I am a lot of things. I'm a historian. I have a history degree, and I specialized in studying revolutions. I am a scientist. I have multiple degrees in earth and planetary science with a focus on what happens when planets collide, and I'm a dancer and a choreographer. I've performed work across the country from New York City to the edge of the Grand Canyon. And in terms of my visual description, I am white, I have long blonde hair, and I am in my office. So behind me is a somewhat disorganized bookshelf full of folders and books and other things.
So, Adeene, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us on Dances with Robots. Delighted to have you. This represents the culmination of our professional relationship, which I think starts, how many years ago with you as a graduate student here at Brown? Can you remind me, how is it that we first met?
I started my PhD at Brown in 2016, and when I started there, I had heard that, if you just show up to classes sometimes in other departments, they'll just let you come in and hang out. And what I found when I went to your modern dance class was that that's true. I could just come in and hang out and learn. And between working with you in that class and then going to subsequent classes of yours and continuing to learn from you there, we also overlapped in terms of me starting to do some choreography and working with the dance department and the dance companies at Brown to make some of my own work. So I think that's how we started getting to know each other. And then I got to do that TEDx talk, TEDx Providence. We should represent them. I respect them in their work eminently. In 2017, and we have just kept on from there.
Indeed. So then maybe to start from that origin, your PhD work, if I'm not mistaken, was largely about smashing rocks into planets. Is that, I'm sure this is a gross oversimplification. Rocks and planets go smashy smashy is sort of what I have written down in my notes.
Stop you right there. It's actually when planets go smashy smashy.
Okay. My apologies to the rocks involved.
You fool.
you idiot. So planets going smashy smashy with one another. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the nature of that scientific inquiry, but also what it has to do with your experience and expertise in dance and choreography.
I'm going to start answering the first part of that question, and if I forget to answer the second part of that question, just circle back to me. So the research part first. Yes, I study what happens when planets collide, because we think in the early solar system it was a very chaotic time, right? The sun forms and then it has all this gas and dust around it, and that's really none of my business. But eventually the gas and dust starts to coalesce into rocks, and then those rocks start to become planetesimals, and eventually you end up with the modern solar system we have now, right? But there's a huge jump from there's gas and dust around a young sun, and we have 8-ish planets, depending on who you ask, right? And that early period is thought to be very chaotic. And the end point of planetary evolution is thought to be when things that are planet-like in size are hitting each other. So, for example, we think that is this common knowledge? I don't know if this is common knowledge. This is a classic, that XKCD comic of everybody knows this. Everybody knows that we think that the Earth's moon formed from a giant impact when a Mars-sized object hit the Earth, right? We all know that. That's something that we can all agree. No?
Not sure this is common knowledge, but please do continue.
Well, after this podcast, it's going to be common knowledge. So no
significantly more common.
Yeah,
knowledge,
get ready,
certainly.
Everybody. Yeah, so we think that a Mars-sized object hit the Earth early on in its history, and then eventually that process formed the moon. And that's something that probably happened a lot in the solar system. It just happened to be really extra cool in the Earth's case because now the Earth has a giant moon. And we also think that happened in Pluto and its moon Charon, for example, are very similar systems. So my PhD research focused on what happens in these large collisions in the outermost reaches of the solar system, and I focused on Pluto and the evolution of Pluto using the information that we got when New Horizons flew by the system in 2015 and trying to reconstruct what in science we call its bombardment history, but basically how many times did it get blasted? You know, that's my scientific work. And then second, I'm circling back. Second part of the question. I've got it. It's here. It's coming. How does this relate to my choreographic practice? Well, everything I just talked about is about the movement of bodies in space, right? How do they cross each other? How are they orbiting around the sun, but then in the process of orbiting around the sun, set on paths that force them to collide? Because it's not like everything's just kind of moving wherever in the solar system. Everything gets caught on an orbit around the sun, but the problem is that everything else also has a gravitational field, right? So everything is constantly getting pushed and pulled and moving around in ways that are difficult to understand. And as I went through the course of my PhD and I continued to try to make dance, what I found myself thinking about was how my body moves in space in ways that cause me to interact with my environment, and why is that? But then I also started to think about how, because the formation of the solar system is something that we're never going to truly understand, right? Unless we have a time machine, but a time machine that can also like watch everything at 500 times speed, we're not gonna get it, right? We're approximating everything. And I think a lot about how to approximate that with my own body and how to reproduce the physics of the Earth and the solar system in the human body. That's my answer.
So I want to acknowledge a distinction maybe between thinking about dance and choreography, bodies moving through space, as a kind of metaphor versus your consideration of dance and choreography in space as in terms of performance, in terms of culture, in terms of thinking about actually how it is that real bodies in actual space, actual outer space, relate to one another, both socially and performatively. And so I wonder if maybe that's an entree to think about your TEDx Providence talk, which has, to this day, my favorite TEDx title of all time, Netflix and Chill at 0 degrees Kelvin. Can you please tell us a little bit about the TEDx talk and kind of what you were grokking, what you were contending with, what you were thinking about at that time?
Sure. I'm still contending with everything that I said in my TEDx talk. That's the cool thing about giving one, is realizing, ooh, I actually did distill something fundamental about how I view the world, and I was successfully able to distill that and put it out there for people to go watch. So that TEDx talk is about how human culture will reproduce itself as we become, theoretically, at some point, a multi-planetary species. What happens when we go to the moon, when we go to Mars? Even now on the ISS, what happens when we, as human people who exist in a context that is fundamentally tied to our experience on a planet of this size, the gravity of the planet, what happens when we remove ourselves from that context? And it's a context that is both as mental as it is physical, right? We expect certain things to happen, right? I drop my coffee cup and it will fall to the floor and I'm sad. But also, if I jump, I know that I'm going to come back down. And so that informs not just how we interact with objects, but how we interact with each other. And as we expand to the moon and onto Mars and think about how to live in space long term, how will that change how we relate to each other, both mentally and physically, once gravity is different? Once you have to move through space differently, when you're cognizant of the fact that, like, if I jump on the moon, it's going to take a lot longer for me to come down. If I am on my 6-month to 1 year trip to Mars, I, at this time, will not be experiencing gravity. How do I interact with not just the space around me, which I no longer have a floor or ceiling, but neither does anybody else? How will that change the movements that we resort to, but also how we relate to each other? That was the TED Talk, and I still think that's a really interesting thing. And one of the coolest things is that we still have the ISS up there today to see what astronauts today do with that kind of freedom of three-dimensional space and having no floor and no ceiling. A picture that just got released this week where the astronauts are doing some sort of thing. I don't remember which of the experiments they were working on in one of the modules, but they had also put up a Christmas tree because 'tis the season. But from the point of view of the framing, the astronauts are standing up and down doing something, but the Christmas tree is upside down because there is no floor or ceiling. You say, if I want to have a Christmas tree in the ISS, I'm just simply going to pick one of the four sides and I'm going to put it there. And sometimes I will be oriented in a way that it looks like it is standing up like me, and sometimes it will seem upside down to me.
So it seems like that invites not just a reconsideration of our physical bodies and in relation to others, and indeed, as you're suggesting, like the literal architecting of lived experience, but also about the nature of the social, the nature of the cultural. And so I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about the social and the cultural here. Like, how is it that space culture emerges? How do you think, what does dance have to do with that?
Well, I think, and you can go back in my TED Talk and find that I said this there, but I think that dance is fundamental to how humans exist in the world. I think dance is fundamental to human culture building, and not just in the sense of we've created standardized dance forms that everyone recognizes, which would be, ballet, for example. It's so much more than you go to the ballet and you see somebody who's very good at a particular style of dance do it at the height of their power. But we are all doing silly little dances all the time. And to interact with each other in ways that reflect the fact that when we feel so much as people that it cannot help but come out of us as movement, I think that's fundamental to what people are. And even if how we dance is going to change when we move society to the moon, for example, or to weightlessness for a year before you get to Mars, either way, we're going to keep dancing because that's something that we're going to do. We're not bringing zero music on the trip to Mars, right? I've got to have my tunes, and so does everybody else, right? And you're going to listen to music, and you're going to react to it, and other people are going to do the same. And part of that is also when you're dancing with other people, it becomes sort of like play, like a game that is social. And we're going to build new ways of doing that. And if you look at there's video of the astronauts on the ISS playing with each other in ways that they can only do because there is zero G. That is something that we're going to continue to develop.
Can you, for the uninitiated, can you share some of those modes of play that are only possible in zero G?
Well, they love to start spinning. One of the favorite things that astronauts really like to do, if you listen to their interviews or read their autobiographies, which I recommend doing, and if you're curious, please send me an email and I'll tell you which ones are actually good, because I've read a lot of them and, it's okay. They're not all good. Anyway, if you consult the literature and you watch a lot of stuff, then you will see that one of the things they really love to do is to start spinning. And then if you start spinning and you spin in place on the ISS as a little ball, you can do that for quite some time because there is no gravity. But you will actually start to move in a direction based on the movement of the ISS itself, and you will start drifting. And so one of the things they really like to do is experiment with how their momentum interacts with the momentum of the space station on which they live, and basically bounce around. And they also experiment with how do you hold on to stuff, right? Because if you will always move. If you try to be stationary on the ISS, you will also always move because you will drift because the station is moving. So they usually end up hooking a single toe onto these rails that are on all four sides to keep themselves stationary as a kind of way to stand still. But you have no gravity, so it's impossible to actually stand flat and not move. You are constantly understanding that you are moving and trying to exist in that space in a way that works for you.
And so the play part is the negotiation of the impossibility of stillness.
Yes.
Relative to the inevitability of movement.
Yes. So it's very easy to knock somebody out of what they're doing because they've like semi-stabilized themselves, but you can shoot yourself in like a rocket and just force them to start spinning. Right.
Bodies colliding.
Bodies colliding.
So, to wit, then, can you tell us a little bit about your performance research? Now, you mentioned performing, choreographing, dancing at the brink of the Grand Canyon. I know your performance and choreographic ventures have been intensely plural over the years. What does your performance research look like these days? What are you interested in? What are you working through?
My performance research is me going outside and thinking about how the human body exists on one timescale and how the solar system and the Earth exists on a different one, and how so many of us are forced to try to contend with that in different ways. And the way that I contend with it is to reproduce those physical processes in my own body. So the last thing that I did most recently was create a site-specific work at the Grand Canyon while I was the astronomer in residence there. And I was trying to do two things with that. The first is to see if I could try to reproduce the way the Grand Canyon formed using my body in a way that was legible to an audience. And some of them came up to me and told me afterwards that they understood what I was talking about, so it wasn't a complete failure. But the other thing that I was thinking about is, okay, planets, the Earth, Mars, even Pluto, they have geologic histories that are billions of years old, right? And they build those up over time. That's why the Grand Canyon is, I think, such a great place to go to think about these things. But you can do this anywhere. I understood that you build the Grand Canyon through layering rocks over time, tilting those rocks, and then eventually the river carves through them and exposes the canyon that we see today. But that's not the end of the story, right? Because then we, humans, are there interacting with the geology, with the planet itself. So the other component of understanding geology as a choreographed performance of time by a planet is understanding that we as humans are interacting with it and changing it in ways both large and small. So the choice to do space exploration and how you do space exploration is just as important as the planet to which you go. And my performance research, as you might call it, is to try to understand how those two things intersect, how we move through space, not just as bodies in space, but as bodies that cannot be separated from our environment. You can remove me from the Earth and put me on Mars, but I will interact with it. I will leave footprints on it. I will leave other things on it. But the choice of what I leave on Mars, were I to go, is mine.
So I love the way that you're talking about geology as a form of performance, or geology interfacing with geology as a form of performance practice. I think that's really audacious, but also deeply in alignment with emergent threads of like ecological justice and concerns for ecological performance. But I think it also invites, a conversation around your dancerly training as an artist and practitioner. So my understanding of your history is that you are trained at a high level as a dancer and choreographic artist. But if I'm not mistaken, you're also kind of perpetually training to become an astronaut. And correct me again if I'm wrong or using the wrong words here. But my understanding here is that one potential, maybe likely outcome of your scientific inquiry, your creative practice, and the sort of disciplining of your body is that you indeed become an astronaut. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the practice of being a dance artist relative to the practice of intending to become an astronaut. How do these things relate to one another, if I have any of those concepts or words in the correct order?
I am thinking about this because I'm trying to decide if I want to give you the fun answer or the serious answer. I will
Dancer's
tackle
choice.
the fun part of it first, and then perhaps, yes, I have trained to be an astronaut, as in so much as you can train to do something like that. Which, for those listeners who might not be aware, how do you become an astronaut? It's quite simple, really. There are two tracks. You can either be in the military, and typically in the Navy or the Air Force, though they have taken others, and the application process to become an astronaut through the military is handled in-house, and that is the end of my knowledge. But that is a way that you can become an astronaut, and the astronaut corps is over 50% military. So this is something to consider. It is also something to consider when considering how the astronaut corps operates and, say, its own culture. The other way to become an astronaut is to be a scientist of some kind. That includes medical doctors, that includes engineers. I realize that any engineer listening to this podcast realizing that I just accidentally lumped them in with scientists is going to be so furious. So you can be a scientist or an engineer. You got a STEM.
Please direct your email to Adeene@denton. Never mind.
I have a criminally Googleable name, so I'm sure you can find a way to contact me, and I will reassure you that I believe that science and engineering are very different things. Anyway, NASA needs both of those. They need medical doctors, etc. And as the story goes, if you ask somebody, how do you become an astronaut, and you are one of these people, you just have to be very good at your job. And that's technically true up to a point, right? I'm just going to explain how the astronaut process works because I think it's interesting.
This is great.
Okay. All right. It's so funny because I'm actually like in the process right now. I made it into some level. So this is how it works. I've applied to be an astronaut twice, but the first time was just kind of a silly, goofy haha because I only barely met the qualifications. But you have to be good at your job. That is true because when you apply to be an astronaut, you go on to USA Jobs. Like every other government job, you just go on to USA Jobs and you fill out an application, and then you have to do a series of you have to make a really horrible CV on USA Jobs. You have to do a series of tests and timed essay questions, and then you just boop all of that out into the ether and you wait. And the first time I applied, I only barely qualified because I hadn't gotten my PhD yet. And I booped mine out into the ether, and they booped me back 12 months later saying, "That was really funny of you." Absolutely not. But I do know how it works later in the process. And basically, they're going to go through all those resumes, and then they will select people that are highly qualified. That is, people that meet what you need to have, which is you need to have you got to have the experience. You got to have a PhD and years of experience in a related field. And many people, well, not many, but enough people that I think it's significant, have raised concerns with the fact that the related field that you have to have experience in has to be a STEM field, right? You have to be a scientist or an engineer. They've never taken a pure mathematician, but it'd be so funny if they did. But they don't consider things like anthropology, sociology, the social sciences. They don't consider humanities at all, right? It's just not considered to be relevant. And I think we will be arguing forever over, is that a good or a bad idea, right? Far be it from me to say, right? Because they have taken people like me before. Jessica Watkins is the most recent example of someone who was a geologist who got a PhD in Mars geology, who is now an astronaut. And it's not like you're getting to directly apply your geology knowledge to most of what you do. Most of what you do as an astronaut is learn how to operate complex equipment safely. And there is a reason that getting a PhD, say, in a scientific field or an engineering field might prepare you to do that. But there's also an argument to be made that, if you get a PhD in anything, it means that you are at least capable of doing something extremely tedious for a very long time, which is a lot of what being an astronaut is hurry up and wait, right? You do a spacewalk, and a lot of it is actually quite tedious. It is choreographed. They choreograph a spacewalk months in advance, right? That's what the Neutral Buoyancy Lab at the Johnson Space Center is for them to choreograph the movements of the astronauts in a controlled environment, so that way it's a rehearsal for the actual performance, which is fixing something on the outside of the ISS usually. I've gotten so far afield. Anyway, Where was I? Ah, yes, the highly qualified stage. I'm allowed to say, because I have not signed an NDA yet, that I made it to the highly qualified stage of astronaut selection this year, which means they contact your references. And that's so kind of you to say. I do not know how much further I will make it than that, because the stage after that is when they fly you out to Houston and then you do in-person interviews. And that's usually like 100 to 200 people. And it's a group interview and they do all sorts of tests and blah, blah, blah. So
I have like a million follow-up questions, but still, that's awesome. And congratulations.
So if you want to become an astronaut, that's how you do it, guys. You become qualified enough to make it to the highly qualified stage, and then you will eventually, from there, they will prune who gets to go in person. And then you just got to show up in person and be a cool guy. And by cool guy, I should finish the explanation at least. One of the things that they prioritize is actually teamwork and your ability to work in a team. Because one of the most important things is if you go in a small space with a bunch of other people, you got to be able to work with them. So I think this is something that a lot of people do not think about, because the vision of astronauts that we are given is the Apollo era version, right? Where they took all these test pilots. I couldn't remember the word test. I was just sitting here like, ooh, they were pilots. Oh!
And they like try things in stuff that's hard.
You know when you're flying, but it's like you're messing around a little bit. Yeah. They took all these test pilots and it was very like hero mode. Tom Wolfe writing the right stuff really set us back in terms of understanding that space exploration and even human-based space exploration, like sending astronauts anywhere, is such a team-based endeavor. It's not a hero mode thing. You can't just show up to the moon cool guy style by yourself, right?
I'm not over the Adeene Denton, Tom Wolfe hot takes part of the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me to this podcast so that I can tell you about Tom Wolfe.
Here's everything that's wrong with the right stuff.
Ooh, I already wrote the Medium article on that, so I simply will not rehash my statement in there.
No, but you've been very clear in public forums previously. We don't need to rehash all of that.
But what that means is that I think people today don't understand that you don't need to be a BBC Sherlock genius guy to become an astronaut. You actually need to be the opposite of that. You need to be someone who is smart at people, at being able to relate to other people and work on teams. And that includes how you physically interact with each other all the time.
Well, and so this goes to the nut of my question then, which is about how your dancerly training, your choreographic expertise, like what these forms of discipline mean in terms of your practicing to become an astronaut.
I think, what is that useful? Yeah, I think so. From two perspectives. One is like, I think that being a dancer gives me, this is the basic answer, which is that I think being a dancer gives you an understanding of your body that most people do not have, both its strengths and its weaknesses, right? I'm very aware at any given time of what my body could do if I went from a sitting position to trying to do anything. And that evolves over time. I love aging. But I think that really gives you a leg up in terms of, there's a huge adjustment period when most astronauts go to 0G, where they have to figure out how do you use the minimum amount of force, the minimum possible amount of your body to keep yourself stationary to do whatever it is you need to do. And I think if you have a lot of prior training with moving your body through space under a variety of conditions, it makes it a lot easier to adapt to a situation. I also have a lot of experience. I haven't done this recently. I used to be a diver. I've done underwater archaeology, excavation type stuff. And it's a similar thing where you have to figure out how am I going to stay in one place so that I can map this area that I'm excavating underwater. And I've found it a lot more intuitive than most people, just because I'm used to figuring out where does my body need to be and how am I going to make it be there and not somewhere else. But I think the other thing that being a dancer really helps with is you have an understanding not just of your own body, but other people's and how they are moving through space. So the other thing that when I was talking about play, right, it's so easy to dislodge, for one astronaut to come in and dislodge another one. But you have to start building up an understanding of where people are in 3 dimensions if you're working in 0G. And it is not often that as dancers we are working as soloists. I have been a soloist several times, but it is mostly due to not being able to afford to pay dancers. I would love to work with dancers. I have no money. I hope that changes. But usually when you are dancing with other people. And even if you are a soloist, you are aware of the position of the audience relative to your body and how they are perceiving you. So I think understanding how everybody else is moving through space is also incredibly critical.
Great. So I'm deviating a little bit from my script here because I want to return to questions of tedium and the choreography of fixing the exterior of the ISS and to the robotic interplay between humans and robots in zero G. So something I've been writing about, talking about, thinking about a lot lately is, of course, choreo robotics, like the highly choreographed nature of human robot interaction. And it seems to me that the ISS or next generation space habitats or space shuttles are essentially giant robots that are populated by humans, and the nature of those interfaces and interplay is what functionally keeps us alive, right? So this is ultimately an argument that thinking about choreo robotics terrestrially has application in space. But I wonder if you agree with this premise that space shuttles, space stations, these are giant robotic enclosures that are filled with oxygen and therefore with a certain kind of culture that we need to navigate, to iron out, to invent before going to Mars or similar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you imagine if I just stopped talking?
I don't know, but I mean, I've actually this has been something I've been circulating in performance studies kinds of arenas, but I've not talked to you about it, which seems bonkers because again, your TEDx talk did this a decade ago, but
don't say a decade ago.
I know, I mean, kill it, but
I must go walk into the sea, which will be very difficult as I'm in Colorado.
Yeah, it'll take a hot minute. But so again, thinking about these enclosures as giant robots that have deep investments in our bodies, is this an accurate premise?
Yes and no. The ISS is a robot in the same way that a Roomba is a robot, which is I have to take the stuff it has vacuumed out of the Roomba, right? And if it reaches a cliff, quote unquote, I must go save my Roomba, right? The ISS is a robot that is piloted by a bunch of humans. And not just the humans that are in it, right? Though the humans that are in it are constantly having to keep it running, right? And in the sense that you have to have CO2. That misspeak was so cringe that I just had to stop entirely. Okay. The ISS is piloted by a bunch of humans, and some of those are the humans that exist on the ISS because someone has to go and fix the CO2 scrubber. It's called Cedra, that scrubs the CO2 from the air, and they have two of them, and if one of them breaks, everybody gets a headache, and if two of them break, that's not good. So they're constantly having to maintain. I think when we think of robots, we think of a static body, right? Like a cool mechanical being that operates without any input from other people, but this is not how we actually experience robots of any kind. Right. I think the robot that people think of when they think of the ISS, which I don't know who the people is that I'm talking about here because I don't know who's thinking about the ISS this much. If you are, I shake your hand, is the Canadarm, right? The Canadarm, the giant robot arm. Canada specializes in making giant robot arms, and they're going to put one on the ISS, and they're supposed to put one on the Lunar Gateway, which is supposedly the next ISS. But will that actually happen? It's beyond me. Beyond my pay grade. And the arm exists to do things that humans can't, but humans must operate it. It cannot make those decisions for itself. Similarly, the ISS, if you view the whole ISS as a robot, it moves through space. It has thrusters that allow it to do that. But because we live in a society, there's a lot of space trash, and the ISS has to then move to get out of the way of space debris. It does not know how to do that. It is people on the ground that are tracking the space debris saying, ooh, the orbits are going to intersect. And then other people saying, okay, ISS, fire your thrusters in such a way that you avoid it. So I think it is, in the end, a good example of humans interacting with robots in the sense that every robot that you will ever interact with is so entirely shaped by a structure of more people than you can ever imagine that allowed it to come into being such that you are seeing it.
So it's like thinking about the robot or space station as an apparatus, as a heavily networked device that is contingent on the inputs of dozens or hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously for its continuation.
Exactly.
So I just want to say out loud and then move away from the fact I'm not going to ask you a million questions about the film Gravity. I'm not going to ask you all of your hot takes about these movies.
I haven't seen Gravity, so that's very kind of you. Yeah, I know. Didn't get around to it. I know George Clooney gets got, and I was like, well, I can't watch it.
Well, George Clooney does get the got. But then he shows up as like a ghost. He's like Ghost Clooney. Whatever. We literally don't have time to talk about it.
Okay, I'm back in.
No. So it's 90 very stressful minutes of Sandra Bullock having a variety of crises, most of them involving space trash. Anyway.
Can I please give a small anecdote that you are allowed to cut about the movie Armageddon?
Absolutely.
It's relevant.
No, absolutely. We need to take time to do this, please.
You may
Go ahead.
recall that in the movie Armageddon, actually very few people recall the movie Armageddon. I was teaching a class this summer and I showed them clips of Armageddon on their last day as a little reward, which was thrilling. The children are the future, and they need
a
to
little
know about
Armageddon as a treat. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
But in Armageddon, they end up having to dock at Mir, the Soviet Russian space station that was in orbit in the 90s. And I remember as a kid, I thought that Michael Bay made that up for the movie. I thought he made up a Russian space station that he then blows up over the course of the movie, obviously. And it was not until I went to college that I found out that that was real, because we don't talk about what the Soviets or the Russians were doing in space. I had no idea that there was a Russian space station that we sent American astronauts to in the 90s. And the only reason I ever thought to ask about it was because I saw Armageddon.
This further underlines the importance of history and culture here. And seriously, like if it's going to be Bruce Willis and Michael Bay and Billy Bob Thornton who teach us the importance of collegiality with the Soviets or whatever, like, here we are.
Yeah, I learned two things from Armageddon. Don't bring a gun to space. And the Russians had a space station called Mir.
I'm stopping myself from asking follow-up questions. We have to move on. Though I am probably going to be screening Armageddon at Brown University, watch this space. So I want to segue a little bit, because we've been talking a little in terms of your own pursuits in relation to like governmental structures like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, NASA, and we're talking about these structures at a moment when space exploration, the corporatization of space technology is being increasingly capitalized, maybe monopolized by folks like Elon Musk, et cetera. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit, if you're willing, about like what happens with the corporatization of space exploration. Like, what are the risks? What are the opportunities here? And how do you interface with all that?
I have thought long and hard about whether to be honest about this. And I'm going to be honest and not very fun. So let's get this out of the way. I think that the commercialization of space, the extension of capitalism to space, is bad. And I haven't seen The Expanse, but apparently that also says that. So if you don't believe me, go watch The Expanse, I guess. But I recommend starting out by reading Capital. There's an illustrated version of Capital. If the text is too small, I understand. Anyway, enough about Capital. Space capitalism is a very silly thing to do, in my opinion. Why? Because you're trying to make... You have to stop laughing.
Sorry, no, curious people want to know. Space
Why does it suck?
You may ask. Oh, no.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. He just kept on laughing, and I was like, I can't
No,
do
I'm
it.
just.
I've got to focus up.
I'm loving it. I will fix my face. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Why is space capitalism bad, you might ask? Well, the easiest answer is capitalism is bad. But don't worry, I won't stop there because that would be reductive. I think the problem with having a bunch of commercial space companies is, what are you making money off of, right? What resource are you trying to exploit in your space capitalistic future, right? I remember it was a talk at Brown University actually by Axios Space. It was one of the space companies. I do not remember which one, and the guy from that company. It's actually better that I don't remember because I'm gonna make fun of him. He said that NASA was too communist, which is like so beautiful, not and very untrue, obviously. But he also said that, one of the things that we can do to make money, because again, there's no real way to make money in space, except for a few options, which I will now outline, is to put ads on the ISS. And then to have commercial space stations, which is something that Elon Musk has said he wants to do, right? Is to have commercial space stations that, people then pay for, etc. So to make money in space, you can do the luxury option, right? Which is where people pay ludicrous amounts of money to go to space. But that's not actually a real moneymaker, right? That's a boutique thing that you do that does not pay for the immense cost of launching a rocket into orbit, because we still have not gotten around the fact that it is incredibly difficult to escape the gravity of the Earth. So the other option is, of course, space mining, right? We all love mining on the Earth, right? We love it. It's so good. But what if you didn't have to think about it because it was on the moon instead? That's so good, right? I've circled back around. Space capitalism is good, actually. I've changed my own mind. I'm sorry, I'll stop doing a bit. I fundamentally feel that mining the moon or mining Mars or mining asteroids is not only a very silly thing to do, because it would be almost impossible to do it profitably if you are a capitalist, which, I'm not going to make that argument. You can do the math yourself and think, how hard would we have to work to actually make money off of getting the deuterium out of rocks on the moon? It's hard enough to get water on the moon. It's all in permanently shadowed craters, which is called that because they're permanently in shadow, which means they're really cold, which means how are you going to go in there without dying? We can't even figure out how to get a robot in there without dying. Anyway, but I think the philosophy behind all of that is the problem, right? It's not just that space mining is stupid and, ruining the moon, though there are already organizations that exist to oppose this on the Earth, which I work with one of them, which is a Navajo organization that opposes space mining because the moon is part of their culture. It is sacred to them. And I'll circle back to that later. But I just want to acknowledge that there are people that oppose space mining simply because it is utterly antithetical to their philosophies and their way of life. And I think that is something worth respecting. And I come at it from the exact same perspective, which is that, why are you doing space exploration, right? Why are you going to space at all? I have wanted to be an astronaut for many, many years. And every year that I keep on chugging, I have to ask myself, why is that? Why do you want to do that, right? And for me, I think space exploration is so cool because I love the feeling of going somewhere I have never been and reconfiguring my whole self around what I've learned. I like to climb to the tops of mountains and look at everything that I can see. I like to do things like that. And so I want to go to space. I want to touch a moon rock with my grubby little hands, right? Is that a good reason? You be the judge. I can fully admit that it is selfish. And I think space exploration in many ways is selfish. But I think a lot of people are motivated to do it and are captivated by it because they just want to see something new. We want to understand our place in the universe, and that means not just understanding us on the Earth, but also all these other places, right? How are all of these other places connected to us? How is it that the same geologic processes that operate on the Earth also operate on Pluto? Pluto has dune seas, Pluto has glaciers, and so do we. And that's what motivates me to study those things, right? Is to understand all of these connections that cross time and space and even material. Because those glaciers aren't made of ice. Pluto's crust is made of ice because it's so cold that ice behaves like rock. And so then your ice on Pluto is nitrogen ice, et cetera, et cetera. That's the kind of thing that drives me towards space exploration. Commercial space is a very different perspective, right? It is, and this is where I'm going to lose people because I'm going to go into, theory. If I haven't lost you all already. The idea of a commercial space company is to go to these places and exploit them, right? It is to say, how can Mars be made a place that is fit for humans? How can we build a moon base, right? Why are you asking that question? What is it that you want from the moon? It seems to me that we want very different things from the moon. I want to know how the moon formed. I want to know at some point between a Mars-sized object blasting the Earth and the moon forming and today, a lot of stuff happened, right? It was probably pretty crazy for a while. I would love to know what was going on. That's very different from somebody saying, I want to drill the moon and take all these rocks out of it and do open pit mining on the moon for my own purposes. I want to terraform Mars to make it a place that humans can live. This is, to me, an extension of a mindset of capitalism, but also of colonialism, right? Of wanting to terraform Mars, wanting to colonize. People just say it. They want to colonize Mars. I think that sucks. And I think you should think about your life if you positively think we should colonize Mars. Because when was there a time that colonization on the Earth was good? Settler colonialism is bad, and it has led to untold strife and hardship. And the reason that European powers were able to do this is because they reframed the places they colonized as terra nullius, right? Which is not just the legal concept, but it's the idea that those places are empty and unknown. And so it has been very easy for people who grew up on the mindset that, places on the Earth can be terra nullius and extend that to Mars and say, okay, there's nothing there, therefore I can do whatever I want with it. Whereas there's an alternative perspective, which is there are so many things there. They are just things that you personally do not respect or value.
That was beautifully and horrifically stated. Thank you. So we are somehow, Adeene, running out of time. I'm going to permit myself maybe 1.5 follow-up questions before I think we need to wrap up. So you have just issued, I think, a really compelling critique of space colonization vis-a-vis space capitalism, right? This makes it's an obvious economic, it's a specious economic argument, right? Terraforming the moon, terraforming Mars. These are means to a kind. For the listener, Adeene just thumbs down terraforming Mars. But it invites also maybe a historical comparison to other colonial superpowers that wielded culture in the service of their hegemonic ends. And here I'm thinking, of course, about France and ballet. I'm thinking about Louis XIV and Napoleon and all of these megalomaniacal ass clowns who conquered giant swaths of the seemingly empty earth and then populated it with a violent insistence on certain cultural norms, namely ballet. And so I wonder if you can talk for just a moment about not only the kind of critique of capital involved here as corporate space travel metastasizes, but I wonder if you can offer a cultural critique. Where does culture play into space exploration as riding the coattails of capital, if that makes sense?
I'm going to answer your question with a question, which is, where we in the U.S. launch rockets from, right? Florida, and sometimes Vandenberg. Do you know where the European Space Agency launches its rockets? French Guiana, which is still controlled by the French to this day. Yeah.
I did not know that. I'm leaving lots of empty space for mic drop noises that we will input in post.
Yes, there's a great article on this by Peter Redfeld called "The Half-Life of Empire in Outer Space." I recommend people check it out and go down the rabbit hole of space exploration, space ethics, etc. Very thorny subject for many people. So to answer your question in a slightly longer format, yeah, space exploration is inherently political, as it is as political as it is economic, right? The many reasons to do space exploration, not just by commercial space companies, but by nation states, is to propagate themselves and their ideas, right? The space race was very effective at building a national identity, right? So we cannot separate empire building from space exploration. It is the same process. Space exploration exists and has existed since its first inception as a ways to, from the perspective of the Americans, shore up American power, right? To show that we can do it. But then also, I'm condensing a lot of stuff. In terms of like, if you are a materialist, for example, as I might be, these same tools are used. The tools that are used to build empire on Earth are used in space exploration. And what I mean by that is, when they sent satellites to the moon to try to map it before the Apollo program, they needed really good cameras. Where did they get those cameras? Spy satellites. They were the same camera. You can go into the documentation and determine for yourself that it is the same camera, and that NASA had to set up a series of contracts with the Department of Defense and the CIA to share technology between them, because it's all the same thing. And this makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist, but like, look, the Freedom of Information Act means that those documents are actually freely available online for you to go through yourself if you would like. And all I'm trying to say is that a camera is never just a camera, right? A person on the moon is never just a person on the moon. When you do anything, you do it in the context of society. And so when we decide to go to the moon or to Mars, it is not just an idea made physical form, right? It is also powered by all sorts of technologies that themselves have made it to this point through specific means. And it is worth thinking about that, right? Especially if it's a huge downer, right? To think about, ooh, is space exploration just, this thing that sucks? No. But it's going to be very difficult to think of an alternative version of space exploration that sucks less, right? So I just encourage any listener to think, okay, if I was to go to space myself, how would I do it, right? How would I, as an embodied person who exists on the Earth, go to space in a way that could reject some of this framing? Is that possible? How would I do it? I would have to work with a lot of other people, because the only way to counteract a system that is made and operated by many machines that are operated by many people is to build an alternative thing.
That's as tactically utopian an ending I think we're going to get on this conversation. Adeene, we're rounding out the hour here. I wonder, just sort of an open-ended question here, anything else that you want to share with our audiences? Anything else that you think we should be thinking about? Anything else that ties dance, performance art, the questions of embodiment and embodied theory to space, to your future, to your person, other organizations we should be talking to or thinking about? Open space, what should we fill it with?
You just cheated by asking like 5 questions at once as if they were bullet points, and I see that you did that, and I want to acknowledge that that is what you did. And now I'm going to try to take on some of those. In terms of other organizations that I think folks should be thinking about, I want to shout out again the Nehoka Dene Protectors Organization, which is the Navajo organization that's working towards rejecting lunar mining, particularly in the context of some of the commercial space companies that exist on American soil. I recommend people also look at Uncommon Cosmos, which is based out of Australia and doing things from an Australian context, which is very different. There are tons of organizations out there who are thinking about how do we do space exploration in a way that is explicitly not just anti-capitalist, but anti-colonial, right? Because those two are very in sync. And to do that, a lot of times it is best to look at this from the people that are already doing it. So if you go to these organizations, you can see these different perspectives. And I think that's super valuable, because not a lot of that is currently being discussed more broadly. So that is something that I would recommend. I'm going to try to end on an even more positive note, right? Because I'm still doing this, right? I could acknowledge that space exploration is to me something that is incredibly fraught. And I keep doing it because I believe that it is important to cultivate an interest in learning about our world and our universe. The first night that I was an astronomer in residence at the Grand Canyon, it had snowed like 3 feet, and it was Super Bowl Sunday. So I was there to give a talk about the next NASA mission to the ice giant Uranus, and they wouldn't let me make any kind of Uranus jokes on any of the ads, which was really devastating to me. So I was like, no one's gonna come, right? They were like, you can't call it Penetrating Uranus the talk. And I was like, every 13-year-old that sees this will come, though. You don't understand. But a bunch of people ended up coming anyway, despite the snow, despite Super Bowl Sunday. And for some reason, the first question I got after this 45-minute talk about why we're going back to Uranus was this person who said, but Adeene, why are we doing any of this? Why are we trying to solve real problems? And I was like, you're on vacation. It's not what I said. Why are we doing this instead of trying to solve world problems? And I think it's so important that we do both. I think it is so important to be able to cultivate a kind of joy in yourself when you contemplate the universe, whether that is looking up and looking at the constellations, looking at the mountains or the sea. I am so comforted by the fact that there are all these other planets out there in the solar system, all these moons that are living and dying and recreating themselves in their geology, covered in volcanoes, covered in glaciers, covered in sand dunes. And just knowing that all of those things are out there gives me incredible joy and comfort to know that everything is so big. And I think it's so important to cultivate that joy for that and use that to guide your inquiry of how to connect other people to that. That is how I will end.
Adeene, thank you so much.
This interview was conducted for the Dances with Robots podcast, a project of the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces. The project was founded by Sydney Skybetter and is supported by the Brown Arts Institute at Brown University. This video was captured on Riverside and produced by Consciously Produced. Production, Ariane, Michaud, executive producer. Fynn, Kugel, producer/video editor. Kate Ladenheim, CRCI, logo design. Kamala Sankaram, music. Dances with Robots team season 2. Ariane Michaud, host, production, and script writing. Sydney Skybetter, interview host. Fynn Kugel, guest host, production, and script writing. Daniel James, sound editor and mixer, voice actor. Kate Gao, website designer, archivist. Special thanks to Adeene Denton for spending time nerding out with us. For more information about Adeene, visit www.adeenedenton.com. For more on CRCI, visit our website at www.choreographicinterfaces.org. Want to learn more? Listen to our podcast, Dances with Robots, and visit www.danceswithrobots.org.